Hi everybody, welcome back to Over Easy Gaming. Today we are going to go back and do um, some more sports talk. Today we're going to talk about my number one fandom baseball team being the Boston Red Sox. I know in the first video that we talked about with sports, I talked about my second team, the Brew Crew, the Brewers, and kind of why I like them. I'm not going to get into that again. Um, but I'm going to be talking about my Red Sox and they're sort of I'm just going to say it now. They're good off season. It was not the off season um, that I think a lot of the fans were expecting or hoping for. Um, I know obviously we're still sitting here on what's today. Today's February 20th, so there's still a little while ago. Spring training hasn't even started yet, or really officially hasn't really kicked off yet. But in about a month, we'll be talking more seriously about the start of the season. So let's dig into my Red Sox here. So I really don't want to be one of these Red Sox fans who, you know, let me back up. Unfortunately, Red Sox fans in the world of baseball kind of have a um, negative view of the team a lot. If they're not spending, you know, Dodger level money and getting all the best free agents, there's a lot of pessimism, I guess, would be the right word. Um, you know, I've been guilty of that myself. Blaming ownership for making this move and that move and not spending money, and I still sort of stand um, on that hill of I think ownership and John Henry in particular are just not doing what they need to be doing, especially with a franchise like the Red Sox. I mean, the Red Sox, it should go without saying. I think they're within the top five of the most valuable baseball franchises, um, really ever. And fans have that expectation of if you're that valuable and you're raking in all this money, and you have very passionate fans, you need to return the favor and um, spending the money when you need to spend it, and clearly when you need to spend it when you have obvious holes in your lineup. But this is not going to be an anti John Henry podcast. I think I'll save that for another day. I think he's bought himself a little bit of time with this uh, recent postseason. So let's get into it a little bit. So I have our their projected, at least their projected lineup pulled up in front of me. We'll talk about the acquisitions, first before we really talk about anything else. Um, so obviously, talking about the elephant in the room, in terms of the big free agents that they kind of missed out on. It was really no secret that they really needed a um, high level infielder. Their defense last year, particularly their infield defense, was putridly bad. Um, Way too many errors, way too many mental mistakes, too many um, guys coming in and out of the lineup, particularly at second base. Then at third base when Bregman was out for a little while. Just it was amazing to me that they even made it to the playoffs with the infield defense as bad as it was last year. So obviously, everyone knows that Bregman opted out. That's excuse me. That's kind of where we'll start. That was kind of, I think the Red Sox waited for a long time to make a move because they really wanted to see what Bregman was doing and where he was leaning. Obviously, he wound up signing with the Cubs. I'm half in, half out on that decision. I don't. I wasn't upset that they lost Bregman because of the player. I mean, obviously, he's a very good baseball player. He's solid. He was obviously very good with the young core in the locker room, and obviously a very good defender. I know he's not old, but he's aging, so his defense is not as good as it was 3 or 4 years ago. But he's still a well above average third baseman, well above average bat. So that was a big loss. That kind of dragged out for a long time. With are they going to bring him back? Is he going to come back? Um, and it just when news broke, that the Red Sox were really not really even in the ballpark in terms of what they were offering him to bring him back. it just was not a good look for the ball club, especially at that time it was sort of late in the offseason and they still hadn't made a move, and then they just lost um, one of their key pieces, their best infield defender, to the Chicago Cubs. So yeah, well, not going to talk anymore about that. So we will talk about some of the other additions that they made. Obviously, they lost Alex Bregman, like I just said. Um, from a defense perspective, from a clubhouse perspective, um, was a pretty big blow to the team. He was a right-handed bat. Obviously, he's not the guy who's going to hit 40 home runs, but he is um, the 25 to 30 home run if he's healthy for a full season, especially in Fenway Park. That was a big loss, big blow. Um, so the other big need, comes to no surprise, was first base. First base, they had Tristan Casas, who missed the vast majority of the season last year with the knee injury. Even when he was playing, he just was not hitting at all. Um, but obviously, as we saw the year prior to last year, kind of what he's capable of, he does have a lot of power and a lot of potential, being as young as he is. So that was a big loss at first base. It was kind of a revolving door of guys at first base. They brought in random guys like Abraham Toro, who, granted, he played well at first base. They picked up Nathaniel Lowe off of waivers, who with the Red Sox played pretty well. But they were really missing that first base piece with Casas out, and just kind of piecemealing it together with some of the other guys. So they did make a trade for Wilson Contreras. Trade with the Cardinals, I should say, for Wilson Contreras and Sonny Gray, who we'll talk about in a second. So Wilson Contreras is obviously projected as the starting first baseman. It is going to be I believe, his 10th year in the league. He is getting a little bit older. He's about 34. But he is a good bat. If I'm looking at his projections right now for this year, at least Fangraphs has him projected as a 2-win player, a 117 WRC plus, 789 OPS. We'll see. Obviously, like I said, he is getting a little bit older, but he has been a good, really good player, former All-Star for the Cubs and for the Cardinals for a lot of years. Definitely solidifies first base, adds a little bit of pop in the lineup that they lost, obviously, with Bregman. I know with the Cardinals, there was a little bit of I guess concern is the word, with some of his clubhouse stuff with them. I honestly, I just think he needs a change of scenery. I don't think the current, how the current makeup of the Red Sox, I don't think they're going to bring in a guy who is a clubhouse distraction to a core of, a lot of really young players on the team. I just don't think they're going to do that. So I think with that, some of that stuff, I think a lot of that was he just really, really needed a change of scenery. I think his numbers will, go up now hitting in Fenway Park, a more hitter-friendly park than St. Louis. Like I said, Fangraphs is projecting him, as a 117, so about 17% better as the average hitter at first base, and solidifying, pretty good defensive at first base. And also on the offense, so I kind of talked about it on the first episode with the Brewers with Caleb Durbin. He came over in a trade with the Milwaukee Brewers. I really, really like Caleb Durbin. I said it in the other video. He reminds me a heck of a lot of Dustin Pedroia. Not only just because he's not a big guy. I think he's 5'9", but I obviously, like I said, I'm a Brewers fan, so I was able to watch a lot of him. He was a rookie last year. He put up great numbers. Obviously, hitting at Fenway Park is going to help him, being in his second year, and I just think he's going to have a big year with the Red Sox as long as he can stay healthy. He's really going to solidify the infield. You can put him at second. You can put him at third. I guess if you had to, you can put him at shortstop. But I think second and third is kind of where he's going to live. I think he's going to probably sit at second base for the majority of the season. Obviously, we'll see what happens with Marcelo Meyer. But Fangraphs has him projected as a 2.5-win player, a 102 WRC plus. I think that's a little low. Like I said, he does not have, he's not the 30 home run guy. He's probably not even a 20 home run guy. But he just reminds me a lot of Dustin Pedroia. He makes a lot of contact with the ball. Doesn't chase, doesn't strike out. I think he only struck out like 50 times last year as a rookie, which is unbelievable, especially for today's standards where everyone in the league strikes out 150, 200 times. So that's going to be really exciting to watch him. Hopefully, fingers crossed, he stays healthy. So those are the two big offensive, additions. Like I said, they missed out on bringing Bregman back, and they were reportedly hot and heavy on Bo Bichette to play, and he obviously wound up elsewhere. But they brought in those two guys to kind of solidify the lineup, if you will. Both Contreras and Durbin right-handed bats, so that definitely helps the lefty-righty matchup. My projected lineup basically has them going lefty righty most of the way down the lineup, which is obviously what you want. And then we'll talk about one of the other guys that they did bring in, IKF, Isaiah Kiner-Falefa. They brought him in on a short-term deal, so I know he came in before Caleb Durbin, before that trade, so there was a lot of grumbling, like, oh my God, we missed out on bringing back Bregman and Bichette. Our pivot is IKF. He's obviously going to be a bench piece. He's going. I don't want to compare him to Brock Holt because I think Brock Holt just overall was a better player. But IKF more Holt was probably a better offensive player than IKF ever has been or ever will be. I'll stick to my guns and say I think they're pretty similar. IKF is a gold glover. He can play a lot of different positions. He can play most of the infield positions. He can play in the outfield. Like I said, very, very solid glove. He's not going to give you a lot with the bat. Fangraphs is projecting him. Let me see here. Basically to be a league average player. So, a bench piece with a 632 OPS. So, yeah, he's not. He might give you a little bit more just because of, obviously Fenway Park and, numbers get inflated with some guys, hitting at Fenway. We'll see. He's not supposed to, hopefully he doesn't have to play, 600 at bats with guys being hurt. He's not going to give you a ton offensively, but he's going to be a very solid piece off the bench. Like I say, can play pretty much anywhere. Gold glove pretty much anywhere. He's, again, not going to give you a ton offensively, but yeah. So those are, the big guys that they brought in on the offensive side. Obviously the big talking point is they are still missed out on the, I'll just call it an impact bat instead of a power bat. They don't have that guy. They don't have the, Manny Ramirez, David Ortiz, JD Martinez. They don't have those guys anymore who, they'll be hitting 35, 40 home runs a year. Obviously we'll see with Roman Anthony. Obviously he, came up last year and showed a lot. Didn't talk about him, but he's not even 22 yet. They're projecting him to be basically a 4-win player at the 124 OPS plus. I definitely think he's going to, probably win. I don't know if he's still considered a rookie. I think he is. Probably, be in a running to be rookie of the year. Obviously, if he can stay healthy. But yeah, they're just missing that impact, 35, 40 home run bat where, teams really have to plan for that guy in the middle of the lineup. I was hoping that they would bring in a guy like Gino Suarez. Obviously, he went to the Pirates on a pretty cheap deal. I think it was more so the Red Sox didn't want him, mostly because they didn't have a spot on the roster for him because Gino Suarez is basically just a DH at this point. He can play third base. Obviously, that's kind of where he's lived defensively, but he's a pretty poor defender. And I know just based on how this team is constructed, they didn't like his defense. And they have Yoshida on the who he's owed a ton of money. They got a bunch of money tied up in him, who's quote unquote the DH. So I think that's really the reason they didn't go after a guy like him who can probably hit 40 home runs, especially at Fenway Park. I'm not too concerned about the power. Obviously, you still have Contreras. You have Roman Anthony. Hopefully, Trevor Story can kind of duplicate what he did last year. So that's 3 guys right there. Maybe Willie Abreu, 3 or 4 guys who can probably hit. For being optimistic, 25 to 30 home runs, and then a handful of other guys who could probably hit 15 or 20. So we'll see. In terms of the offense compared to last year, I do think it is a little bit improved. Obviously, not going to talk about the Bregman thing again, but I think Caleb Durbin, I know Red Sox fans don't know a ton about him. I think they're going to get to know him quickly. And I think he'll quickly become a fan favorite. That's my hope anyway. But just looking, this is obviously not going to be the order, but looking, Roman Anthony, Trevor Story, Darren Duran, Wilson Contreras, Willie Abreu, Narvaez, Caleb Durbin, Marcelo Meyer, and then Rafaela. Not a bad lineup. It's a pesky lineup. A lot of different, there's speed in there, there's some power in there. So I do think it is a little bit better than last year, especially with, like I said, Contreras kind of solidifying that first base role a little bit. Then off the bench, you have Connor Wong, who's listed as the backup catcher. Romy Gonzalez, who was awesome last year, coming off the bench and played in a lot of different roles in the infield. IKF, Isaiah Kanafalefa, obviously, like I said, he can kind of play everywhere, give you a lot of really good defense. And then we have our boy Yoshida. If he can stay healthy, I think he can contribute, more than he has. Last year he was out a lot. He did show a decent amount when he first broke onto the scene. I think there's kind of a misconception that he was going to be this big game changer from Japan, which obviously he played really well in Japan. He was on a championship team in Japan, but he was never going to be that 40 home run guy. He's a contact first guy. The big question with him was, especially even in Japan, was his defense. He was not a great defensive outfielder in Japan, and that obviously translated to the big leagues where he can play outfield, left field. If you had to have him out there, he can. You don't really want him to, but they have a lot of money tied up in him, so that's why I said they didn't bring in. That's why I think they didn't bring in a guy like Gino Suarez to just be that thumper in the middle of the lineup. So that's going to be at least what's projected to be starting lineup. And then we'll look at starting pitching, which I'll pretty much say that they almost have a whole new rotation. Obviously, they have Garrett Crochet at the top, who is pretty much going to be the Cy Young, one of the Cy Young favorites. I think he finished second or third last year. So fingers crossed he can stay healthy. So obviously he's going to be the number one. He's still 27. Fangraphs has him projected with an ERA under 3. Obviously over 200 strikeouts and WAR near 6. So obviously kind of hopefully, like I said, he's had some injury issues in the past with other teams. Last year he pitched more than he's ever pitched in his professional career. So hopefully that doesn't come up to bite us in the butt. But if he's healthy and at the top, he's that number one, obviously, that they want. And then the big money that they did spend was for Ranger Suarez this offseason to be really the number 2. He is definitely a number 2 and a very, very good number 2. He might even be a number 1 on a lot of smaller market teams, but he is a very solid number 2. That was definitely a hole that was needed or addressed, I should say, in the offseason with the Red Sox. They brought in Crochet last year, and then they had the experiment with Walker Buehler to be the number 2, which that did not go super well, to no one's great surprise. But Ranger Suarez, does have a good track record, is a very, very good pitcher. Another lefty. He does not throw hard. He's a control guy. He puts the ball on the ground, which is another reason why bringing in, more defensive guys like Caleb Durbin and Contreras is a good thing. So he's a ground ball pitcher. He kind of reminds me of a Derek Lowe in his prime. But he is 30. Fangraphs is projecting him to be a 3.5 win player. ERA near 3.5, 170 innings. Not a huge strikeout guy. They're projecting him to be like an 8 strikeout per 9 guy, which, like I said, he doesn't throw very hard. He throws 91, 92, but gets a lot of soft contact, gets a lot of ground balls. He's going to be, he definitely makes his team better because he is a bona fide number 2. And then, number 3, they brought in Sonny Gray over from the Cardinals. He came over and part of that Contreras contract. So Sonny Gray, he's been around for a long time. I believe this is going to be like his 13th year in the league. He's 36, going on 37, but still a very good, very good number 3 or 4 pitcher. He might be on number 4 with, Brian Bello I think Bello will kind of surpass him being that number three. But a really good option for number three. Fangraphs has him projected as actually a little bit higher of a WAR than Ranger. I have him projected as a 3.7 WAR versus Rangers a 3.4. He is more of a strikeout pitcher than Ranger. Maybe that's might be why they project him to be a little bit more valuable in terms of wins than Ranger. But he just brings another good veteran presence. He's been on one of the knocks on him is, last time he did pitch in the AL East was with the Yankees. If there's any Yankee fans watching, they probably hate this guy because the Yankees, I think they gave up quite a bit to get him. I think he was like an offseason mid-season acquisition a handful of years ago, and he just did not kind of crapped his pants and went to New York. So we'll see. Obviously, that big veteran in that rotation. He's been around for a long time, knows how to pitch. Has always been a good, above average pitcher. Fangraphs, like I said, they have him around a 3.5, 3.7 ERA. I think it'll probably be a little bit higher. I think it'll probably be around a 4. But we'll see. And then we have obviously Brian Bayo, one of our homegrown guys, listed as a number 4. Improved quite a bit last year. Hopefully he can keep growing and improving. He's going into his age 27. He's 27, so he'll probably be 28 by the time the year's over. Going into his 4th year. Fangraphs has him projected as basically a 2-win pitcher. ERA somewhere around 4. We'll see. That's definitely where I would probably put him. But he did show quite a bit of improvement last year, so hopefully he can continue with that. And then rounding out, we have Johan Oviedo, who came in over from Pittsburgh in a trade. I think he's kind of not going to say he's the least talented guy, but just because he's number 5. There's a lot of talk about him. He's had some injury concerns. I don't think he's really put together really a full season since he's been in the bigs, but a lot of upside with him. A lot of guys really, really like him. So you have Suarez, Gray, and then Oviedo really kind of solidifying that rotation. And then obviously, from the rotation standpoint, they did lose out on Lucas Giolito, but I do think they definitely, Giolito was not on number 2 anyway. He was probably like a number 3. So they replaced, the Gray to Giolito. I think that was pretty much even. And then they, like I said, brought in the Suarez to solidify the 2, and then Johan Oviedo with Crochet. I definitely think, it's not news. I think it's probably one of the best, probably top 5 rotations in baseball. They're really going heavy on the run prevention. Like I said, the Suarez guy, there's a couple guys in here, the Suarez, I think Gray too, he produces a lot of ground balls. So that's really where they need that really good infield defense. And then bullpen, so not a whole lot has changed in their bullpen. Bringing back Roldis Chapman. He was one of the big reasons why they made the playoffs last year. He had an unbelievable season as their closer last year. I think this is going to be his either 15th or 16th year in the league. He is 38. Hopefully he can replicate or be as good or comparable to what he was last year. So you have Chapman in the closer spot, and you still have Whitlock, Slayton, Weissert, Kelly, and then they brought over a couple guys. Kyle Keller came over from NPB. He's a little bit older. I don't know a ton about him, or Ryan Watson, who I think was a non-roster invite or Rule 5 draft guy. So it'll be interesting to see if they make the team in spring training. But overall, very solid bullpen. Just the staff in general is very, very solid. It's definitely the strength of this ball club. And then we'll look at the injuries. So Tristan Casas, obviously with that big knee injury last year in May, he's definitely going to, when he's healthy, he's definitely going to enlist, unless there's a lot of injuries, he's probably going to start in AAA. And then, they do have more guys starting pitching wise. So if they do have injuries, they still have Cutter Crawford, obviously, Tanner Houck. He had Tommy John surgery last year, so I don't know when he would be ready to go. And then they did bring in Patrick Sandoval last year, who did not pitch. He had elbow surgery in 2024, so I think he could have pitched last year. I think he just opted not to. He came over from the Angels. Another really interesting arm that they brought in not this year, but last year. So we'll see what they do with him. You know, his numbers are pretty average in terms of kind of like a league average pitcher. But if you look more, I'm not going to do it here, but if you look more closely at his more advanced metrics, his FIP, so like his at what his ERA would be if he was on a good team, is I think like either a half or a run lower than what his actual ERA was. So it just kind of points to him, being on a bad Angels team. So um, obviously we'll see what they do with him. He might not even make the squad to start the year, but just another depth piece that they have from a rotation standpoint if they need to go there. And then we will see what else we got going on um, in the minors. So really the only guys worth talking about, Christian Campbell. He kind of, he played like his hair was on fire at the start of last year, made the big league squad, had a couple good weeks, played pretty well for the month of April, and then really fell off the table, sent him back down. They're having him try a couple different positions. So we'll see what we get out of him. We'll probably see him again this year. Hopefully he's grown quite a bit in terms of just as a baseball player and just development. He's still very young. He's 23. Um, so I know they're still excited about him. They brought in Brandon Rogers, who is a big time prospect about 5 or 6 years ago with the Rockies. He's bounced around MLB for 5 or 6 years, mostly with the Rockies and I think with the Astros. So he's another kind of interesting piece. Again, he most likely won't make the team. Obviously, if there's injuries and things like that, he's another piece for the infield that they can go to if need be. And then they brought in also the Durbin trade. I think I talked about the Brewers. They brought in Anthony Siegler and Andrew Monasterio, who he's a very interesting guy to me. He had a lot of big hits for the Brewers last year. Same thing, can play a lot of different infield positions. So those two guys you might see them. And then they just have a lot of guys. Nate Eaton, who we saw last year, super speedy guy. Siegler, Sogard, Monasterio. So they have quite a few infield options and some pretty interesting options. And also from the young pitching side, we saw Connolly early. He might even make the squad in the starting rotation. He came up last year and pitched very, very well. Pitched in the playoff game. And then you have Peyton Tole, who they drafted in 24. He's, I think, probably the number one pitching prospect other than early. So those two guys, they'll probably be fighting for a spot this spring, but we'll absolutely most likely see them this season. In what capacity, I'm not sure. And another one of the interesting pieces, Jake Bennett, they traded early on in offseason in December with the Nationals. Big tall guy, 25, big lefty. He's currently in Double-A right now. I know Red Sox are big on him. So, pitching wise, they've definitely invested very heavily in pitching over the last couple seasons. Early and Tole are obviously very exciting prospects. And then obviously their rotation is really the strength of the team. So in terms of, do I think this team is better this year than last year? On paper, obviously we're talking about this in, we're not even in March yet. Spring training hasn't even really kicked off all that, yet. So obviously there's going to be injuries and kind of the random guys that break out and make the squad and things like that. But in terms of, do I think they're going to be better? Are they better on paper this year than last year? Absolutely, yes. Just mostly because of their pitching and their depth, and also some of the the infielders that they brought in to kind of solidify the defense in the infield at least. I definitely do think they are better. In terms of when I started talking about this video with the